Now, you'll find that working within Azure through App Controller is remarkably similar to working with your private cloud. So for example, if we come up here to clouds, you'll find that we have access to both our clouds at this point, except at this point we don't have resources where we can move stuff around, but I'll get to that in a second. But similar to how you would deploy things by right-clicking, clicking on deploy, and getting that canvas I showed you in the earlier lessons, very similar to that. You can do that with Azure as well. Right-click, click on deploy, and you're going to be presented with that similar type of functionality that you are deploying now, except you're deploying into your wired brain infrastructure as a service onto the public cloud. So if I click on select the template here, or select an item, you're going to get the library of resources and items that you have access to within Windows Azure. This has nothing to do with what you've got on your private cloud at this point. So this is what Microsoft is making available to you within the private cloud, within the public cloud. So you click on images here. These are the images that they have available to you, which you can select, click on OK, for example, and this will, voila, it will expand and deploy these virtual machines, and then you can come in, specify any kind of virtual networks. If there are any virtual networks that you had configured, you would have been able to configure that. We don't have any virtual networks deployed into the Azure cloud, so there's really not much for you to configure here. But under the virtual machine, for example, again, you want to be able to come in and configure these services by starting off up here. You're the first thing that you want to create, and then you're going through and you're giving this a service name. What are you going to call this? You're giving it a description, you're giving it a public URL, a whole slew of things that you can configure here, and then you can go through and again give it a particular personality per se, and go through the whole stack in order for you to get from the cloud service into the network into the virtual machine. We're not actually going to go through and deploy this again. It's incredibly similar to what we've been doing throughout the course, so you should be very familiar with that. Just wanted to show you what it would look like to work within your Azure cloud from within App Controller. Well, that so far has been working with Azure using Microsoft provided templates and Microsoft provided resources. But what if you wanted to use your own resources, your own templates, your own VHDs, your own ISOs? Well, how would you go about doing that? Well, let's take a look at the library real quick. So under the library here, you'll find that I have access to all the resources and objects that Windows Azure has given me access to. And I also have access to some of the library objects that I have access to, or that I've been given access to by my administrator on VMM01. So things like templates that reside that I have built. These have nothing to do with the public cloud, except I can't move these into the public cloud yet. There is no connection to do that. I also have resources on my web's cloud, for instance, that I could try to manipulate. So the first thing we want to be able to do, and this is going to sound incredibly similar to what I mentioned to you in an earlier lesson, where remember when we were talking about, well, if one of the developers wanted to upload something into our private cloud, into the Wired Brain Enterprise Private Cloud webs, there was a window where you can put in a path. That path would create a storage location for that developer, for that user, to upload certain assets that they would want to use, where it's very similar. Windows Azure, the developers of Windows Azure, have made similar functionality available to you so that you can create a storage repository that you can then move assets that belong to you, that you want to then use within the Windows Azure cloud. So to do that, we're going to select our own cloud within Windows Azure, and then we're going to create storage, which is essentially creating a storage repository onto the Azure cloud that belongs to us. Now, this has to be unique among all the containers that are available on Windows Azure. So make sure you're finding a name that's not going to be used. So what I'm going to do is just create wired brain coffee, and I'm just going to do 01/2013, and hopefully David Davis or any of the other administrators or instructors at Train Signal haven't used this before. So I'm going to use that. So let's go ahead and remove that capital letter here, and there you go. So now we want to select the region. Which region do you want this to be available? I want to put this as closely as possible to where I am geographically. So I'm in Chicago, which means the closest thing to me is probably going to be East US here. So I'm going to go ahead and select that. and then we're going to go ahead and click on OK. Now this will initiate a job that's going to run on the Windows Azure in the background. Now in the meantime, while this is completing, what we want to do is, if you want to move some of the assets that you have in your VMM library here, well, then you'll be able to do that once the storage repository has been created. If you wanted to connect additional shares so that you can move things from other locations into the Windows Azure or have access to it from App Controller, then what we want to do is add another share here in order to get access to that. So what I'm going to do is select shares, and then I'm going to click on add here, and I'm simply going to give this a whack VMM01, and this is the share library that we've been using for VMM. I'm going to go ahead and click on OK. This shows me that this was successful. Thank you very much. And now if I go ahead and double click on here, you'll find, voila, you now have access to all of those directories that you had access to on this particular Windows share, and we have access to all of those objects that are also within these directories. Now, our storage repository on Windows Azure was completed successfully, so thank you very much for that. So what you can do at this point is you can move resources to this particular storage repository. So if you select it, it's going to be blank. You can create additional containers below it. So for instance, if you wanted to create something, I don't know, maybe you want to move ISOs up here and you want to organize, the types of resources that you have within that particular container. Well, now you have the option of doing that. So for instance, if we wanted to, I don't know, let's come in under the application config deployment here. Let's find the particular file. If you want to copy this file onto that ISOs repository, you can simply click on copy here. And then what you want to do is just simply drag down there and then in here. And what we're going to do is essentially come under ISOs, and we can click on paste, and you're going to paste that particular file onto that drive, and then it becomes available as you're deploying these virtual machines when you're trying to grab ISOs or when you're trying to grab VHDs or whatever that asset that you're trying to accomplish will be available to you, because it is now available in your Windows Azure storage repository that we've created.